Welcome to the AgeWell podcast, brought to you by the UCD Ageing Network. Hosted by Olayinka Aremu, this podcast brings you fresh, inclusive conversations on aging, health, and community. We're so glad you're here. Happy listening and stay tuned.
Hello and welcome to the AgeWell podcast. This is a space where we connect hearts, minds, and generations to reimagine what it means to age well. And I'm your host, Olayinka Aremu from the UCD Ageing Network. You know that each episode we bring together voices shaping the future of aging, from researchers and policymakers to caregivers and community advocates. And guess what? Today, I'm joined by someone whose voice you may recognize from probably radio and television, but whose heart has long been rooted in community and compassion. Maia Dunphy. You're welcome to AgeWell.
Thank you, Olayinka. Thank you for having me. I was thinking before I came on.
Thank you.
My friend, Marie Victoire, who's actually a lecturer in physiology in UCD, I don't know if you know her, she invited me to the launch of this AgeWell initiative. And I went, and then you guys asked me to do the podcast. And I thought, I have no place being here. I'm not an academic. Everyone else like you are extremely well qualified academics. And then I thought, actually, I will say yes, because I think, and I know from documentaries I've made and work I've done that actually, and I'm sure you agree with me, having lots of different voices is really important. And especially when talking about anything community or society based, because sometimes, I hate to say this, but academics can unintentionally, unwittingly intimidate the layperson. So, I think, when it comes to aging well and community, I think it's really important to have lots of voices. So thank you for including
it. Is. It definitely is. And this is what this podcast is all about, bringing the different voices that will amplify, the vision and, the advocacy, vision for aging well, not just in Ireland, but globally. So our guest, Maia Dunphy, is a freelance media professional, just by introduction. She's going to talk more about herself. And she's an ambassador with Our Lady's Hospice. She's passionately, advocating for dignity, friendship, and support at every stage of life. Maia, it's such a pleasure to have you with us. So welcome to the AgeWell podcast.
Thank you so much for having me once again.
Okay.
It's funny when you introduced the podcast talking about shaping the future around aging. And I think sometimes we're shaping it by just getting older. And I don't know where I started in media 25 years ago, and now I've just turned 50, and I keep hearing ads on the radio for things like shingles vaccinations, and I say things like, if you're over 50, and I go, how can I suddenly be in that bracket? And, I think, as we all know, life only goes in one direction. So, I think we should all be having this conversation. And it's funny because working in media,
absolutely,
working in media, you're often thrown together with people of very different ages. And I think sometimes traditionally, certainly for my parents' or grandparents' generation, they tended to stay in peer groups of their same age. I know we're going to talk about it, but intergenerational friendships, it was unintentional that I have friends who were 15 years younger. I have friends who are 15 and 20 years older. And I think that it gives you a different perspective anyway.
Yeah. And to be honest, you just mentioned something there. I know we're going to be talking about, aging and end of life care. And this is one area that I feel that people don't really want to talk about. So let's start from the beginning, Maia. I know you've worn many hats, right? You're a writer, broadcaster, producer, but you've also become a powerful advocate for aging and end of life care. So can you share with us and our audience what drew you into that space personally?
It's a funny thing, end of life care. And I think, it's, life only goes in one direction. And the one thing that we all have in common is that we will all die one day. Now, you don't want everybody worrying about it. You don't want children and young people worrying about dying. That would not be any way to run a society. But I think sometimes when you've experienced grief, I lost my mum 3 years ago to pancreatic cancer. She was far too young. We miss her terribly. But I think that shared experience of grief opens up more conversations about end of life. And certainly I've heard someone describe grief as being like a club that you don't want to join, but everybody will join it at some point or another. And my grandmother, I have one Irish grandmother, one Spanish grandmother. My Spanish grandmother died in a hospice in Dublin 17 years ago. That was my first time setting foot in a hospice. And when I walked in, I was terrified. I never, ever wanted to go into a hospice. To me, a hospice was a scary place that people go to die. That was all I knew about it, Olayinka. But when my grandmother passed away there, I realized that it's an extraordinary place that brings a lot of peace to the people who are passing and gives peace of mind to the families and friends of that person. They're incredible places. So since that time, I became involved with helping the hospice around fundraisers and their coffee mornings and things like that. And I became more and more involved. And as my profile grew a little bit, they asked me to be an official ambassador. And it's such a great privilege. And I think I think hospice care in Ireland is, I mean, like everything, they always need more funding. But I think, like me, a lot of people think of it as being quite a scary place. And I think what's fantastic about the hospice movement in Ireland is they have tried to build the hospice move in a direction to make it part of the community. And I know I'm meeting a friend next week in Harold's Cross Hospice, which is the biggest one. I'm meeting her for a coffee just in the cafe there. Nobody is dying. We're not there to visit anybody. We're just going to have a coffee there because it's become a place that I don't find scary anymore. In the hospice in Blackrock in South County Dublin, there's a small pool that's used for water physio. It's also used several times a week for water babies, for baby swimming classes. So they've opened up this place. And now on Sundays, you hear these giggling babies coming out or going into the pool. And it's a wonderful kind of full circle of life, and not what I expected an end-of-life care facility to be. And I think that is something that I think a message they would like to get out there. And as an ambassador for the hospice movement, what I'd like people to be, they're not scary places. They're places that if you ever have cause to use them, you will see the importance of the work that they do. And I think, talking about end of life, it's not easy, but it's really important that we do. And I think, by having these conversations that are rooted in life and love and positivity, it's really helpful. It shouldn't be a scary prospect because it's one that, unfortunately, we all face.
Absolutely. It shouldn't be a scary process. I love that because, when you ask people the question, do you want to grow old? People say, yes, they want to grow old. But if you say, do you want to feel old? Nobody wants to feel old. And then the other question I ask is, do you want to die young? So nobody wants to die young, and that's just the fact that we are all going to grow old. And so that's such a very profound, contribution you have shared it. Sometimes it's those personal encounters like yours with vulnerability and care that kind of reshaping how we see life itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
So Maia, would you say your media background helps you to bring like these stories to light in a different way?
I do, yes. I mean, when I started out in television, I was mainly working in comedy, and very rude, lowbrow adult comedy. I absolutely loved it. And then I had the opportunity to start making my own documentaries. And I realized that what I was interested in was other people's stories, and especially women's stories. And I think sometimes people say, oh, you share a lot of personal things. And actually, I do and I don't. But I think sometimes, and I'm sure you know this in the work you do, that if you share something personal with someone, they're more likely to share something personal back with you. So actually sharing a personal anecdote or vulnerability is a way to say to somebody, you can trust me with your story. And the documentaries that I made, I covered everything from women and alcohol, the perceptions of beauty. I did one about aging and getting older. And what it made me realize is that, media is no country for old women. It really isn't. Like this cliche that we all know that men are allowed to get old in the public eye, and we talk about silver foxes, and men are allowed to go bald and have gray hair. But God forbid a woman on television would have wrinkles or have gray hair. And the one thing I learned from the shows that I produce, and now as a woman who is in midlife herself, is that I think it's really, really important that we see older women represented in media, in print, on television, on radio, but in real, authentic ways. Not somebody who's 65, but everyone goes, but she's amazing because she only looks 40. It's really important, I think, that we allow women to get older. And to do that, we have to be able to see them. It's one of those cliches that if you can't see it, you can't be it. And I think the tide is starting to turn a little bit in media. We're talking more about menopause, about women's health getting older, things like that. And I think that is something that I've been very aware of over the last number of years.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Maia, for sharing that. I also do believe that, the media, has a big role to play, especially in creating awareness. Now, let's go to the power of connection. You've touched on that a couple of times there. You often talk about the power of intergenerational friendship. You mentioned that earlier. And I
Yeah.
do love that because aging well isn't just about, living longer. It's about living connected, right? So what do you think why do you think this relationship, I mean, the intergenerational friendship, why do you think it matters so much for both younger and older people?
I think it's a when you think about the main difference between young and old people, and of course there's physical things, there's collagen. I'm starting to lose that. There's all those things, but I think the main difference between young and old people is only one group knows what it's like to be in the other group. And when you were old, you were once young, and yes, it was a different time, and hindsight and nostalgia are not always helpful. But younger people don't know what it's like to be older. And the intergenerational friendships that I have always come around accidentally. I never sought out much younger friends or much older friends, but in media it does happen slightly more naturally as well. And I think it's such a joy to have friends like that. And like I said, to have older people in your life who not just can advise you, but I mean, I'll be honest, my own dad, my father's a great example. My father is 85 years old. He's so my dad always says that, getting old, she said, getting old is one thing, but getting elderly is another. He said, I can't help getting old, but I'm going to fight getting elderly. And also, age is, or being old, much older is a mixture of two things. It's a mixture of health and attitude. Now, your health, you could only do so much about it. Like my mum was far too young when she died. She got pancreatic cancer. There's not much you can do about that.
Oh.
But if you have good health, your attitude is so important. And my dad and my parents traveled, that they loved to travel. When my mum died, my dad started traveling with me and my son and my sister and younger people. And we have done everything from, like, we were dancing the street at the Pride Festival in just south of Barcelona last year. We were listening to music in Galway a few months ago. And my dad, he's a very curious man, and I'm a very curious person. And so the older friends that I have are also very curious people. And I think that is, and I think it's also, there's almost, because my mom was Spanish, people call the Mediterranean approach. And here, a lot of the time, groups were separated. You talk about, oh, that's an old man's pub, or, there's a younger person's nightclub. Whereas you walk into, now I know this is generalizing, but often you'll walk into a restaurant or a bar or a cafe in the Mediterranean, even in mainland Europe, and they're just much better at having, there's children in there, there'll be old women in there, there'll be old men, people are all mixed up. And I think we're starting to happen slightly more in Ireland, but we have to kind of create that sort of mentality. And it's a good thing to have all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds, demographics, and ages in one place. And that could only be a good thing.
I love that. That's, different demographics, different, people from different regions connecting. And that's something I think that we also need to do better in Ireland. The healthy aging concept, it's well established, but we need to see that interconnection, that's, inclusivity as well. Like you talked about your mom being from Spanish. We need to see that intergenerational from multiple, culture as well. And so I think that's also resonated deeply with our work at, UCD Ageing Network, where we see connection as medicine. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, but what do you think?
Across you, Olayinka,
just speaking of this.
Sorry to cut across you. When you mentioned inclusivity, inclusivity is such a buzzword now. And to me, inclusivity doesn't just mean diversity of culture. It also means of age, and I volunteer in my local area with a couple of different groups. And I think it's really, really important that we have people from different backgrounds, different cultures, also different age groups, and I think that is to see that when you have an older person and a younger person who might be from very different backgrounds, it's not just the age that makes them different or they can learn from, but it's all sorts of things. And that's what inclusivity is. And it's just so fundamental to a healthy society, I think.
It is, and I completely agree with you there that sometimes we just use these words. It's becoming like a boss, like a cliche or something like that. Yeah. So I was going to ask there, in terms of getting this message out there and using the media, what do you think communities generally, or even the media, can do better to encourage these friendships? Yes, my daughter went for a debate for the first time, and the title where they were talking about social media should be banned for under 16s, and she was actually opposing that motion. And one of the things she said was, during COVID, it was social media that was, the saving grace for everyone. So imagine if that is banned and all of that. So just saying, connecting older people. And one thing we wanted to make sure for this podcast is we want our older people to be able to listen, because they won't be reading the research papers. They're not going to be going to conferences anyways. So passing this information, research evidence and all these healthy practices in a simpler form to our older people and making it kind of connected with different generations. So what role do you think the media has to play in this?
I think you've made a lot of really, really valid points there. I mean, even talking about banning social media for under 16s, the other end of the age spectrum, I don't think banning anything is a great idea in general. I think you have to always accept that things are a part of life, and we have to educate our young people, support our older people. I don't think banning things is ever a solution. It feels quite lazy to me. And like you say, you think about during COVID, and the people that suffered the most were the ones at both ends of the age spectrum, the very young people and the very old people, some of whom aren't with us anymore, who lost a very important part of life. And a lot of older people, I was involved in an initiative during COVID that was helping much older people to become a bit more tech savvy, to help them to use an iPad or an iPhone or WhatsApp, or, so they could actually Skype or video call people. And I think sometimes we really underestimate older people too, and what they're able to do. And there are lots of initiatives around, certainly I know some around Dublin where I am, where younger people will volunteer to help older people with things like tech, as I've just mentioned. And that is a wonderful initiative. And it's not in any way condescending, because sometimes, older people are they're afraid of the phone. They are, now a lot of them aren't. I think we shouldn't underestimate them, but we can't leave people behind. And I think media has a very important role to play in that. Because, we talk about even little small things like there's an airline now talking about ruling out, eliminating printed out boarding passes, physical boarding passes. Everything will be online. I have an elderly aunt, and she is petrified of that. She said, I don't have a printer. I said, it's okay. You don't need it. We can work it out. You can have it on your phone. She said, I can't do it on my phone. I said, no, it will be absolutely fine. Because she was going to the library, printing out her boarding pass before she went. And she only travels a couple of times a year to see her. But it doesn't take much to help support people and to make sure that they don't feel left out or become left out. And the media has a huge role to play. So does the government with initiatives and funding. And I don't think it takes much to bring people up to speed. And technology, technology can be very isolating, but for the most part, I think it's a very good thing. It will never replace human interaction. And I think as things like AI increases, I can see it already. People are seeking out more human contact. They're seeking out more experiences, more interactions with real people. And I think that as things like AI increase, we're going to see more and more of that. And we can't let older people be excluded, because we all know, I think most people now know, we talk about aging well, it's not just about getting older, like you say, getting older and staying happy and healthy for as long as possible. And we know about the importance of nutrition and all these things, but also we all know now about the dangers of social isolation, the importance of communication. That's what this is mostly about. And that is so important, that we make sure that the people in our communities are not isolated. And it's not just the older people. A lot of people that I would know in midlife are starting to isolate themselves from from other groups they would have socialized with. And in that respect, the media has a very important role to play, I think.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And just speaking about, we're still talking about media there, and this is really tied to your background. A lot of people, they dread growing old or aging. And if we're talking about intergenerational friendship, we want to bring the younger generation to also embrace aging, right? So just still tying down to media, is there a way that you think that media could tell the stories of aging that will move us beyond all these stereotypes that we've talked about earlier?
Yes, I mean, I think it's, like I said before, it's so important to see older people represented, but represented in a positive light. And I see it in, if you're 85 and you're happy and healthy and going about your business and exercising, you don't see yourself as being 85. It's not what it once was. And I think it's so important that we do it in a very, there's that word, inclusive way again, where we don't tell stories for people. We let people tell their own stories. And I think there's also a great, there's this kind of perception that younger people don't want to see older people in advertising, on television, and that's simply not true. And we've seen that in even some big campaigns for beauty companies, for clothing companies, for deodorant companies. Some of them are very well known, where they have started using a more broad representation of the market, and consumers respond really well to that. So it's actually an economically good idea as well to represent the people better, who are the ones who are going out and buying your product or watching your show or reading your books or buying your newspaper. And I think it's very disingenuous to assume that younger people don't want that. And certainly I think everything is cyclical, and I think there's a little bit of I see it now in women much younger than me. There's a little bit of a pushback. I mean, I was part of the generation where, not me, obviously, everybody was obsessed with a certain kind of beauty. And now, with things like filters and then the real life versions of getting fillers and these things. And I think there's a bit of a pushback against that. And I think we talked about AI earlier, things like that increase. I do think that human beings have a way of pushing back against these things, and that will keep happening. It will take for enough people to stand up and say, you know what, this is what a real human being looks like when they're 50, 60, 70, 80 and beyond. And that's okay.
Yeah, I like what you said. In fact, I noted it down that we don't tell stories for people. We let people tell their own story. I think that's really profound. Let's take a moment to talk about end of life care. I know talking about it can be difficult for many families to face. How do we encourage more open, compassionate conversations about death, dying, and dignity, especially also using the media as well?
I think the first thing we have to do is talk about it more. I think I mentioned earlier about the hospice movement. I think most people in Ireland are familiar with, whether they've had cause to use their services or not. I think everybody is aware of the hospice. And like I said, just demystifying end of life care and palliative care is a very important thing. And I do think the hospice does that very well. And just opening up more conversations around it. And sometimes that can come from grief and bereavement. It doesn't always have to come from that. But I think that is, and also respecting, I think life has changed a lot in Ireland now. We used to have sort of one idea of end of life, I think in Ireland traditionally, people always say we do death well. My son was born in the UK. I spent 4 or 5 years living in England. And it was anathema to me in England that if somebody dies, you don't all go to the funeral. You have to wait to be asked. The funerals are quite small. Whereas here, if somebody dies, if you can go to the funeral, you go to the funeral, whether it's your neighbor's mother, your friend in work's grandfather, we go. And I think that's something that we have always done quite well. And now that our traditional beliefs in Ireland are changing a little bit, and they're broadening and they're becoming more diverse, we're seeing a mix of different kind of attitudes and belief systems, which is also a great thing. But I think fundamentally what we have to do is is talk more about it. And like I said, demystify it and, make it, sounds a bit odd, but make it almost a part of not healthcare, but that conversation around health, life, and living. Because, like I said, it's the one thing that we all have in common is that our lives will not, unfortunately,
Yeah.
go on forever.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love how you bring humanity back into that conversation, talking about we embracing, and you said in Ireland we do deaths well. I think it's the first time I'm hearing that. And, reminding us that dying well is part of living well, isn't it? So let's look ahead for a moment. I think we're coming to the end of this now. When you imagine Ireland, just the vision for the future. When you imagine Ireland 10 years from now, what would you most like to see change in how we support people at later stages of life?
I think we hear an awful lot in the media about pensions and expenditure and the critical imbalance that's coming our way from having an aging population. And, sometimes that can be just all numbers to people. But I think almost every issue we have in this country comes down to housing. And and that affects older people, as much as any other cohort. And what I would love to see, and I've seen it in some of the voluntary work I do is with older people, and some of it is quite sensitive and things that I can't really talk about publicly because it's a very private thing. But one of the big issues I see with isolation is to do with housing, and I would love to see Ireland just have a better approach to. Not just locking people away in nursing homes, which is incredibly expensive and there are huge waiting lists, but assisted living, communal living, supporting people to live as independently as they can in a very positive way. And there just aren't enough options for people now. There's an initiative called Home Share, which I think is amazing, and I hope it takes off more, where younger people who maybe can't afford to live in a certain part of the city can rent a room in a house with an older person who just wants the peace of mind having somebody else there. And maybe in exchange for vastly reduced rent, you might cook a couple of meals a week, or if you drive, take them shopping. And it's just that peace of mind that comes with having somebody else there. And I think that's a fairly new idea. It hasn't been a new idea. I spent a year living in Malaysia, and there's multi-generational households. Same in Spain, multi-generational households. But then a lot of the time, I'll always say to people, isn't it great you're part of a culture where when your granny gets old, she comes to live with you? But then I thought that I was just, I just thought this was a wonderful thing. And they said, Maia, the truth is sometimes we have no option. We have to have our granny come. There's nowhere else for granny to go. And that's obviously ideal even for the granny. But I would love to see more conversations around and more options around assisted living and communal living, which again comes back to kind of intergenerational society and connection, but also allows people to live well and live independently. I think that is a really key thing.
Yeah, that's very inspiring. You touched on our shared future vision, inclusive community, better home support, and other alternatives, and especially celebrating aging. And really, this echoes what we believe at the UCD Ageing Network, and that aging isn't just, it's not a personal journey, and there's this shared social responsibility, that is very important in aging and community. So before we wrap up again, I think I still want to hear you one more time. If you could leave our listeners, and our listeners ranges from, older people themselves, the family caregivers, the researchers, the academia, the clinicians, everyone generally, old and young. If you could leave us with one message about aging and community, what would that be, Maia?
I think to echo what I said before about if you look at younger and older groups, only one knows what it's like to be in the other shoes. I think we need to sometimes not act like aging is a disease, and to see the benefit that there is in intergenerational friendships, in respecting that people do know, maybe do know what you're going through and might have some very good advice for how you might age better. And the best person to ask for that is somebody who's there already, an older person.
Yeah. Beautifully said, Maia. Thank you so much for your warmth, honesty, and for reminding us that aging well is as much about connection and compassion as it is about care. And to our listeners, Thank you for tuning in to the AgeWell podcast brought to you by the UCD Ageing Network.
Thank you.